The middle of St. Peter's Square, where the crowds gather each morning and the shadows of the colonnade swing slowly across the cobblestones, there stands a single shaft of red granite. It rises without inscription, without hieroglyph, without any carved word to explain itself. Visitors photograph it, rest against its base, wait beneath it for a glimpse of the Pope at the window above, and most of them walk away never knowing what it is, or where it came from, or what it took to bring it there. It has become furniture to the modern eye, a fixed point around which the life of the square simply happens, the way a boulder in a river becomes only the shape the water bends around. And yet, this stone is older than the square, older than the basilica behind it, older than the faith it now stands sentinel over. It was old before Rome was Rome. It was cut from the earth of Egypt, in a place once devoted to the sun, centuries before a single stone of St. Peter's had been quarried. And it has been standing upright, in one location or another, for more than 4,000 years. It is granite, dense and reddish, veined with the pale flecks that mark stone drawn from the quarries near the first cataract of the Nile, at Aswan, where the ancient Egyptians cut obelisks whole from bedrock and dragged them, unbroken, down to barges waiting on the river. This particular obelisk was raised, according to the record that survives, not for a pharaoh's tomb, but for a temple to the sun god at Heliopolis, a city whose name itself means the city of the sun, though almost nothing of that city remains today beneath the sprawl of modern Cairo. The obelisk has no hieroglyphic inscription, an absence that has puzzled historians for centuries, since nearly every other obelisk of its kind carries the name and titles of the ruler who commissioned it. This one is silent. It does not say who ordered it cut, or why, or what king believed his name deserved to rise into the Egyptian sky on a needle of solid stone. It simply exists, mute and enormous. A plain shaft of pink granite weighing, by most careful modern estimates, somewhere above 330 tons. 330 tons of solid rock. Consider that weight for a moment, not as a number, but as a fact of the world, as something that has mass, that resists, that does not want to be lifted or carried or moved in any direction at all. A modern loaded freight car might weigh close to 100 tons. This single shaft of stone weighed more than 3 of them combined, cut in one piece, without seam or joint, a single continuous mass of granite quarried whole from the earth. And this stone, this vast unbroken weight, crossed the open sea. Not on a raft, not on a chain of barges lashed together in the shallows of the Nile, as other obelisks had traveled along the river in the age of the pharaohs. It crossed open water out past the mouth of the Nile and into the Mediterranean, along a route where wind and current could seize a vessel and where no shore was near enough to offer shelter if something went wrong. It was carried whole and entire across hundreds of miles of open sea, from Alexandria to the port of Ostia, and from there up the Tiber to Rome itself. No ship built for ordinary purposes could have carried it. No merchant vessel of the ancient world, built to hold grain or wine or the modest cargoes of ordinary trade, had a hold shaped to take a single object of that mass and that shape. Long and narrow, more than 80 feet in length, a shaft that could not be broken into sections, could not be distributed evenly the way a hold full of amphorae might be balanced, but had to rest as one continuous weight, pressing down along a single line through the belly of the ship. To carry it, an entirely new vessel had to be conceived, one built for no other reason than to move this stone from the coast of Egypt to the coast of Italy. It would sail once for this purpose, and its name would remain fixed forever afterward to the memory of the object it carried. Before Rome could raise this stone in the place where it now stands, it first had to build a vessel unlike any that had sailed before it, a ship whose entire design existed to answer one question: How do you carry something that should not be able to move? The undertaking belongs to the reign of Caligula, the young emperor whose name today is remembered mostly for excess and instability, for the stories, some verified, many exaggerated by later hostile historians, of cruelty and strangeness that have overshadowed almost everything else about his rule. But whatever else can be said of him, Caligula inherited an empire flush with the wealth of Egypt, a province he and his predecessors regarded not merely as a source of grain, but as a kind of private treasury, a land whose monuments and resources existed, in the Roman mind, largely to be taken and repurposed to Roman glory. Augustus, decades earlier, had already brought obelisks out of Egypt to stand in Rome, raising them in the Circus Maximus and the Campus Martius as trophies of conquest, visible proof that Egypt's ancient wonders now answered to Roman power. Caligula wanted his own. He wanted a stone that would stand not in a public circus among crowds and games, but in his own private gardens, a personal monument to his own reach and appetite, a shaft of ancient Egyptian stone raised for no purpose beyond the fact that he had wanted it and had gotten it. It is this detail that gives the story its particular strangeness. Other obelisks brought to Rome served, at least nominally, some larger civic or religious purpose: a temple, a public spectacle, a monument to empire meant to be seen by the crowd. This one served an emperor's want, plain and unadorned. Caligula desired the obelisk for the gardens attached to his own estate at the foot of the Vatican Hill, a private pleasure ground where he could look upon a stone taken whole from Egypt's oldest sun temple, evidence of the reach of his will over both distance and matter. To bring it to him, a ship had to be built that had never before existed in that form, and quite possibly never existed again, a vessel so large, so specifically designed around this single unrepeatable task, that ancient writers who described it seemed almost as startled by the ship as by the obelisk it carried. Pliny the Elder, writing decades later, would call it one of the most remarkable things ever to sail upon the sea, and would spend more words describing the ship itself than the stone within it, as though the vessel had eclipsed, for a moment, the very thing it was built to serve. This, then, is the story that unfolds from here. Not merely the story of a stone, though the stone is remarkable enough on its own, ancient and silent, and improbably intact after 4,000 years of history's upheavals, but the story of the ship built around it, the ship conceived for a single voyage and a single purpose. Engineered against the ordinary limits of ancient shipbuilding to carry a weight the ancient world had never before asked a single vessel to bear. It is the story of the forests felled, to build her the harbour works reshaped, to receive her the strange logistics of loading a mass that could not be lifted by any ordinary means, and the voyage across open water in which the ship and stone depended entirely on each other's survival. It is the story of what became of the vessel afterward, when her singular purpose was fulfilled and she had no further use in the world, and it is the story of the stone's long life afterward, moved again centuries later, raised anew in the square where it stands today, having outlived the empire that brought it across the sea. Outlived the palace gardens it was meant to adorn, outlived even the memory of the emperor whose want had set the entire undertaking into motion. Before any of that can be told properly, it helps to sit for a moment with the strangeness of the beginning, an obelisk without a name, a stone whose inscription was left blank by whoever commissioned it. Crossing an open sea it was never designed to cross, carried by a ship invented purely to solve the problem of its weight. It is a story that moves slowly, the way the ship itself must have moved, low in the water, heavy with its singular cargo, watched by everyone who saw it pass as though something impossible were quietly, patiently happening in front of them. If that kind of story appeals to you, the slow unfolding of an old and remarkable thing, told without hurry, you may want to subscribe, so that more of these stories find you as they're told. For now, let the harbour at Alexandria come into view, and the empire that waited across the water to receive what it had built a ship to carry. To understand why a ship would ever be built for a single stone, it helps to understand what Rome had become in the years after Actium and what Egypt had come to mean to the men who ruled it. The battle itself had been fought at sea, off the coast of a land far from the Nile, but its consequences flowed all the way down to Alexandria, where a queen and her lover had staked everything on resisting Rome's reach and lost. When Octavian entered Egypt in the year following that battle, he did not simply conquer a kingdom. He inherited one of the oldest civilizations the Mediterranean world had ever known, a land whose monuments already stood ancient when Rome itself was a scattering of huts along the Tiber. It was a strange kind of victory, the sort that leaves the winner half in awe of what he has taken. Rome had swallowed an empire, but Egypt, in its stones and its temples and its long, unbroken memory, seemed to swallow something back, a fascination that would last for centuries, expressed again and again in marble, in painted walls, in the importation of gods, and, most strikingly, in the importation of Egypt's monuments themselves. Augustus, as Octavian would become, understood the value of symbols better than perhaps any ruler Rome had produced. He had built his power not merely through legions, but through the careful arrangement of images, his own face on coins, his family's lineage tied to gods, his victories translated into buildings that would outlast memory. Egypt offered him something no Roman quarry could. Stones already carved by pharaohs 1,000 years dead. Stones that had stood before Rome existed at all. Stones whose very age spoke of a permanence that Augustus wished to attach to his own reign. Among these stones, none carried more weight, literally or symbolically, than the obelisk. An obelisk, in the land where it was born, was never merely an object of admiration. It was a claim. Carved from single blocks of granite, quarried at Aswan and floated down the Nile on barges built for that purpose. These tapering shafts of stone were raised in pairs before temple gates, inscribed with the names and deeds of the pharaoh who commissioned them, and dedicated most often to the sun god Ra, whose light was said to strike their gilded tips each morning before it touched anything else in the land. To erect an obelisk was to announce a reign's power in a form built to outlast that reign by millennia. The pharaohs who raised them at Heliopolis, at Karnak, at Luxor, understood stone as a kind of eternity, something that would not weather down to nothing, would not burn, would not forget. An obelisk did not merely commemorate a ruler. It stood in for him long after his body had gone into its tomb, and it did so in the sun, in public, at the center of the most sacred cities in the land. When Rome took Egypt, it did not take these monuments immediately for granted. In fact, for a time, they remained where they had always stood, understood even by the conquerors as belonging to a religious and civic order that was not to be casually disturbed. But Augustus was a patient student of power, and he saw quickly what these obelisks could do for Rome if they were made to stand somewhere else. If a stone raised by a pharaoh in praise of Ra could be transplanted to the center of Roman civic life and made, instead, to praise Rome. The idea was audacious in a way that only the truly confident could attempt. It meant taking not just gold, not just grain, not just the tribute of a conquered land, but its very identity, carved in granite, and hauling it bodily across the sea to stand in a different city under a different sky, dedicated now to a different order of the world. The first obelisks moved this way, arrived in Rome under Augustus himself, brought from Heliopolis, and raised in the Circus Maximus and the Campus Martius, where they served not only as monuments but as instruments. One of them, remarkably, was set to function as the gnomon of an enormous sundial. its shadow tracking the hours across a piazza built specifically to receive it. The message was unmistakable to anyone who understood what these stones had once meant. Egypt's pharaohs had raised obelisks to declare their closeness to the sun god, their eternal reign over the land of the Nile. Now those same stones stood in Rome, repurposed to mark Roman time, serving Roman ceremony, subject entirely to Roman will. The gods of Egypt had not been abolished so much as absorbed, folded into the apparatus of an empire that took what it needed from every people it touched, translating even the most sacred symbols into the language of its own permanent. Alexandria was the city through which all of this fascination flowed. Founded by a Macedonian conqueror who himself had once dreamed of ruling both Greece and Egypt together, Alexandria had grown, in the centuries before Rome's arrival, into something unlike any other city in the ancient world, a place where Greek learning and Egyptian antiquity mingled in the same streets, where the great library held the accumulated knowledge of 100 civilizations, where granaries stored the wheat that would one day feed the population of Rome itself, and where monuments looted or gifted from older Egyptian cities stood alongside newer structures raised by Ptolemaic kings before them had wielded. It was to Alexandria that the Heliopolis obelisks had first been brought, centuries before Rome ever took an interest in them, moved there by a Ptolemaic ruler who wished to adorn his new capital with the same sacred weight that Heliopolis had long possessed. In this sense, Alexandria was already practiced in the art of moving obelisks before Rome ever attempted it. It had done so for its own glory, gathering the symbols of older kingdoms into a new imperial city built on ambition and trade. When Rome absorbed Egypt into its empire, it absorbed Alexandria's granaries, its scholars, its harbour, and, in time, its stones. The city became the gateway through which Egypt's wealth and Egypt's meaning both flowed toward Rome. Grain ships departing from its harbour to feed the capital, and on occasion, far rarer and far heavier cargo departing to feed something else, the appetite of an empire that wanted to be seen as the rightful heir, not just to Egypt's riches, but to its very antiquity. To stand a Heliopolitan obelisk in a Roman square was to say wordlessly that Rome now held what Egypt itself had once considered untouchable and eternal. It was to say that the pharaoh's claim to permanence now belonged, by conquest, to the emperors of Rome. It is worth pausing here on what it means for a stone to be moved this way, uprooted from the one place it was quarried and raised, carried across a sea it was never meant to cross, and stood again in a city that had no part in its original purpose. An obelisk at Heliopolis belonged to the Nile, to the temple it faced, to the particular light of an Egyptian dawn it was carved to catch. Once moved, it belonged to nothing in that same way again. It became instead a kind of traveling proof of distance covered, of labor spent, of an empire's reach extending far enough to seize even the most rooted and immovable things and make them mobile. There is a strange power in this act, one that says as much about the taker as about the thing taken. Rome did not need Egypt's obelisks for any practical purpose. Wheat fed the city. Obelisks fed only the idea of Rome, the sense of a civilization vast enough to relocate mountains of stone across open water simply to prove that it could. By the early years of the 1st century, this practice was neither new nor uncontroversial, but it was established. Augustus had shown that it could be done, that Egyptian granite could survive the sea, that Roman engineering could match Roman ambition when the two were pointed at the same goal. The obelisks he raised stood as precedent and provocation, both precedent, for any emperor who wished to leave his own mark by bringing yet another piece of Egypt home, provocation to any who doubted whether Rome's reach truly extended as far as its emperors claimed. It was into this atmosphere, decades after Augustus first set his obelisks up in the Circus Maximus, that a young emperor came to power with tastes for excess that even his predecessors might have found remarkable, and an eye that fell before long upon another obelisk still standing at Heliopolis. One that seemed, to him, exactly suited to a purpose only he, among all the rulers of Rome so far, would attempt. To understand what Caligula wanted and why the stone he chose mattered so much to him, it helps to travel back long before Rome existed at all, before the Tiber had a name that mattered to anyone beyond the small villages along its banks, to a city on the eastern edge of the Nile Delta, called by the Egyptians Iunu, known to later Greek visitors as Heliopolis, the city of the sun. It was here, according to the estimates historians have pieced together from the stone's own proportions and the styles of the era, that the obelisk was first raised sometime in the early 1st century of the Common Era by one count, though some scholars push its origins earlier still, into the reign of an unnamed pharaoh whose name the stone itself does not preserve. This absence of an inscription is, in itself, one of the enduring puzzles of the obelisk story, for nearly every other obelisk raised in Egypt during this period carried some record of the ruler who commissioned it, some declaration of the god it honored, some hieroglyphic testimony meant to endure as long as the stone itself. This one did not. Its 4 faces, as later observers would note with some puzzlement, remained smooth and bare, a blankness that seems almost deliberate against the elaborately carved surfaces of its sibling monuments elsewhere in Egypt. Historians have offered various explanations across the centuries, that it was left uninscribed due to some interruption in the reign of whoever ordered it, that it was intended for a purpose that never fully materialized, that its surface was meant to be finished later and simply never was. None of these explanations can be confirmed by the surviving record, and so the obelisk arrives into this story already carrying a mystery, a silence pressed into stone that no amount of later scholarship has been able to fully resolve. What can be said with more confidence is the obelisk's material, for granite of this kind leaves behind a signature that geologists and archaeologists have been able to trace with some precision. The stone is a single piece of red granite, quarried not near Heliopolis itself, but far to the south, at Aswan, where the Nile narrows between granite outcrops that had supplied Egyptian builders with stone for monuments since the earliest dynasties. The distance between Aswan and Heliopolis is considerable, some 500 miles as the Nile winds northward, and the labor of extracting a single unbroken shaft of granite of this size, then transporting it down the length of the river without a fracture or flaw that might compromise its integrity, represents an engineering feat in itself. One accomplished centuries before any of the ships or cranes that would later move the stone across the Mediterranean had been so much as imagined. The quarrying methods used at Aswan are reasonably well understood, from surviving examples of unfinished obelisks left in the bedrock, their abandoned mid-extraction after cracks appeared, testament to how often such work went wrong. How many attempts must have ended in failure for every obelisk that made it successfully to a temple courtyard? The stone chosen for what would become Caligula's obelisk evidently avoided such flaws, or at least avoided them well enough to survive the journey down the Nile intact, a survival that already marks it as somewhat exceptional among its kind. Once raised at Heliopolis, the obelisk would have stood as one part of a much larger religious landscape, for Heliopolis was, by this point in Egyptian history, already an ancient center of solar worship, home to a priesthood whose traditions stretched back further than most other religious establishments in the ancient world. The obelisk form itself carried deep symbolic weight in this context, understood by the Egyptians as a petrified ray of sunlight, a stone rendering of the sun god's presence on earth, its pointed tip meant to catch the first and last light of day. Whatever pharaoh commissioned this particular stone, whatever ceremony accompanied its raising, whatever prayers or offerings marked the occasion, none of this survives in any written account that has come down to modern scholars. The obelisk stood in near anonymity, one shaft of stone among the many that populated the temple precincts of Heliopolis by this period, its own history already thinning into uncertainty even before it left Egyptian soil for the first time. That first displacement came sometime later, under circumstances that are somewhat better documented, though still frustratingly incomplete. By this point, Egypt had passed from the rule of the pharaohs into the hands of the Ptolemaic dynasty, Greek in origin but Egyptian in the trappings of their rule, and it was during this period, or perhaps slightly after, that the obelisk was moved from Heliopolis to Alexandria, the great cosmopolitan city that the Ptolemies had built on the Mediterranean coast to serve as their capital. The reasons for this move are not fully recorded, though the pattern is a familiar one from this era of Egyptian history. Alexandria, unlike Heliopolis, was a city built to impress a showcase of Hellenistic ambition dressed in Egyptian ornament, and its rulers had a habit of gathering ancient Egyptian monuments from older cities and relocating them to their new capital, where they served less as objects of active worship and more as symbols of continuity, proof that the new Greek-Egyptian order could claim the deep antiquity of the pharaohs. It was in this spirit most historians believe that the obelisk made its first journey, carried or floated somehow from Heliopolis to Alexandria, where it was erected once more, this time within what came to be known as the Julian Forum, a public space named, whose long entanglement with Egypt and with Cleopatra had drawn Rome and Alexandria into an intimacy that would eventually reshape the fate of the entire Mediterranean world. The obelisk's placement in the Julian Forum meant that by the time Rome's attentions turned decisively toward Egypt, following Caesar's death and the eventual absorption of Egypt into the Roman world under Augustus, the stone was already standing in a space touched by Roman naming and Roman influence. Still an Egyptian monument on Egyptian soil, its granite still marked by whatever ancient quarrying tools had shaped it at Aswan centuries before. It stood in the Julian Forum for a considerable stretch of time through the transition of Egypt from an independent kingdom to a Roman province, through the early decades of imperial rule, a silent witness to the accumulating Roman presence in a city that had once been the jewel of the Ptolemaic world, becoming something more provincial, more thoroughly absorbed into the administrative machinery of an empire centered in Rome. It is worth pausing here, before the stone's story moves further west, to consider what it means that this single piece of granite had already lived through so much displacement and transformation by the time it caught the eye of a Roman emperor. It had been cut from bedrock at Aswan and carried the length of the Nile, raised at Heliopolis in honor of a sun god, whose worship predated Rome's founding by more centuries than most Romans could have comfortably reckoned, then uprooted from that place of original consecration, laid down again in a forum named for a Roman general who himself would never see Egypt fully absorbed into the empire he helped create. By the time this story properly begins, then, with a young emperor's ambitions turning toward this same stone, the obelisk had already been twice displaced, twice removed from the ground where it had first stood, twice made to serve purposes and audiences its original builders could never have anticipated. It arrived into Roman consciousness not as a virgin monument freshly discovered, but as an artifact already layered with history, already carrying the weight of one civilization's worship and another civilization's ambition, its granite surface blank of any inscription that might explain itself, mute testimony to a past. For all their appetite for Egyptian antiquity could not fully recover or explain. This was the stone, ancient before Rome existed, and doubly displaced before Rome ever touched it, that would soon become the object of an emperor's singular and unprecedented want, a want that would require, for its fulfillment, a vessel unlike any that had sailed the Mediterranean before. The young man who wanted the obelisk was not, by most accounts, a patient man, Gaius Julius Caesar Augustus Germanicus, whom history would remember by the soldier's nickname his father's troops had given him as a child, Caligula. Little Boots had come to power in the year 37 with a swiftness that surprised even those who had groomed him for it. He was not yet 25. He had spent his childhood in military camps and his adolescence in the shadow of a court thick with suspicion and sudden death, and whatever else might be said of the 4 years he held the empire. No one who wrote of him afterward accused him of small ambitions. The historians who survived to record his reign, Suetonius chief among them, and after him, Cassius Dio, described a ruler who conceived of his own will as something that ought to reshape the physical world around him, who measured his power not merely in armies or in law, but in structures raised in spectacles staged. In things done that no one else had thought to attempt. Whether these accounts exaggerate his character for effect, as later Roman writers were sometimes inclined to do with emperors who fell from favor and were succeeded by rulers eager to distance themselves from the memory, is a question historians still weigh. But even allowing for exaggeration, the pattern that emerges from the record is consistent enough to trust in its broad outline. Caligula wanted to build, and he wanted to build in ways that startled the city that watched him. Some of what he built has vanished entirely, known only through the descriptions of writers who saw it or heard of it secondhand. He is said to have constructed a temporary bridge of boats across the bay at Baiae, stretching for miles across open water, so that he might ride his horse over the sea itself in an act that ancient sources frame as equal parts military theatre and personal vanity. A demonstration that the natural world bent when he asked it to, poured. He commissioned pleasure barges of a scale and luxury that would puzzle archaeologists for 2,000 years, vessels outfitted with marble floors and plumbing and gardens, built not to carry cargo or fight wars, but simply to prove that such things could be built and that he could command them into being. He planned, according to the sources, projects of engineering that his successors would either complete in modified form or abandon outright. Canals and harbours conceived on a scale that matched his own sense of what an emperor ought to be capable of ordering into existence. Against this backdrop, the obelisk was not an aberration in his reign, but a fitting expression of it. One more instance of a young ruler measuring his authority against the resistance of the physical world and finding that resistance. Occasion for wanting the obelisk was, in its outline, simple enough. Caligula intended to build a new circus, a long oval track for chariot racing, at the foot of the Vatican Hill on the western side of the Tiber, on land that had belonged to his mother's family and that he now meant to reshape into a monument bearing his own name and his own taste. Circuses were nothing new to Rome. The Circus Maximus had stood for the races since the earliest days of the city, rebuilt and expanded by emperor after emperor, and any new circus would inevitably invite comparison to it. But Caligula seems to have wanted his circus to carry a signature no other circus possessed, a single unmistakable mark at its center that would announce to every spectator who ever sat in its stands that this ground and this spectacle belonged to him. The spina, the long raised barrier that ran down the middle of a Roman circus and around which the chariots turned, was traditionally decorated with statues, small shrines, markers for counting the laps. Caligula's plan called for something else entirely at the heart of his spina, the obelisk from Heliopolis, already ancient by centuries when Egypt was young, would stand upright at the center of his racetrack in Rome, a spire of red granite rising above the dust and the chariots and the roaring crowd, visible from every seat. It is Pliny the Elder, writing his sprawling natural history within a few decades of these events, who gives posterity its clearest and most astonished account of what the undertaking actually required. Pliny was a man who collected facts about the world with an appetite that bordered on the encyclopedic, and among the wonders he catalogued, the ship built to carry Caligula's obelisk earned a place of particular emphasis. treated not merely as a footnote to the emperor's building projects, but as a marvel in its own right. Worthy of description, alongside the great constructions of Egypt itself. Pliny records the dimensions of the obelisk with the precision of a man who wanted his readers to grasp the full weight of what had been moved, and he lingers, too, on the vessel itself, describing it in terms that convey clearly enough that even to a Roman audience accustomed to engineering on an imperial scale, this ship had seemed extraordinary. His account, brief as it is, remains the single most important surviving witness to what was built and how it was regarded. And later, writers, when they wished to speak of the age's capacity for engineering ambition, returned again and again to Pliny's description as their primary source, since no other ancient author left so detailed a record of the undertaking. What made the plan more than mere royal whim, what turned it from a wish into an engineering problem of the first order, was the plain physical fact standing in its way. No ship existed in the entire Roman world capable of carrying an object of the obelisk's mass. This was not a matter of finding the right captain or securing the right funds. The merchant vessels that plied the Mediterranean in that era, even the largest of the grain ships that carried Egypt's wheat to feed the city of Rome, ships already reckoned enormous by the standards of the age, had never been built to bear a single rigid mass of stone. A cargo of grain, however vast in total tonnage, distributed itself. It shifted, settled, could be loaded and trimmed to balance a hull built along conventional lines. An obelisk did nothing of the kind. It was one unbroken column of granite, and wherever it lay, its full weight bore down upon that single place, threatening to crack the timbers of any ordinary hull beneath it, to break the ship's back before it ever left the harbour at Alexandria. This was the impossibility that sat at the centre of Caligula's want, and it is worth pausing on how strange a position it placed the engineers and officials of his court in. Here was an emperor's order, and Roman engineers were not in the habit of telling emperors that a thing could not be done, whatever they might privately have believed about the wisdom of the request. And yet, the ordinary tools of Roman shipbuilding, refined over centuries and capable of extraordinary things, simply did not extend to this. There was no design sitting ready in some yard at Puteoli or Ostia that could be adapted with minor modification. The problem was not one of scaling up an existing vessel, adding a few more strakes of planking, lengthening a keel by a modest margin. The mass involved was of an entirely different order, and a ship built along the proportions that had always governed Mediterranean shipbuilding, however large, would simply fail beneath such a load, would open at the seams or snap along its length the moment the stones settled into the hold. See. And so, by whatever combination of pressure from above and calculation from below, by whatever conversations passed between the emperor, who wanted his spectacle, and the engineers who understood what building it would actually demand, the decision took shape that no existing ship would serve, that the ordinary solutions of the age would not suffice, and that if this stone was ever to leave Egypt and stand in Rome, an entirely new vessel would have to be conceived from nothing, designed around the singular, awkward, unprecedented burden it was meant to carry, and built for no other purpose in the world than to carry it. That vessel would rise, if it rose at all, in Alexandria. And so it was to Alexandria that the eyes of the project turned, to the shipwrights who worked along its harbours and had done so for generations, heirs to a tradition older than the city itself. Older even than the dynasty of Greek kings who had built the city on the bones of an Egyptian fishing village and called it their own. The shipwrights of Alexandria were not men who improvised. They were the inheritors of centuries of accumulated knowledge, passed from master to apprentice in a chain that stretched back before memory, a craft honed on the particular demands of the eastern Mediterranean, where the sea could turn without warning and where the cargo, more often than not, was the very thing that kept an empire fed. They knew wood the way a physician knows the body, which species bent without splintering, which held fast against the worm, which grew straight enough to serve as a keel, and which curved naturally into the shape a hull required before a single axe touched it. They had built the ships that carried wine and pottery and slaves across the width of the sea, and they had built above all the grain ships. And it was the grain ships that gave them, and the age they lived in, a sense of what was possible. To understand what the obelisk ship would need to be, one had to first understand what already existed, for Rome by the time of Caligula had grown so vast, so hungry, that keeping it fed had become a maritime enterprise unlike anything the ancient world had attempted at such scale and with such regularity. Egypt was the granary of the empire, its fields flooded and renewed each year by the Nile, in a rhythm the Romans had learned to depend upon absolutely. And the wheat that grew in those fields did not simply appear in Roman markets by accident or by small increments. It arrived by fleet, and the ships of that fleet were already, by any reasonable measure, giants. Accounts that survive from the period describe vessels capable of carrying enormous quantities of grain, ships whose holds could feed the city for days at a time, whose hulls were built deep and capacious to maximize the volume of cargo they could carry across open water in a single voyage. One such ship, described in the writings of a philosopher who happened to witness her in an Egyptian harbour, so astonished her audience with her length and her breadth and the sheer improbability of her floating at all that the description survived to this day as one of the clearest windows onto just how large Alexandrian shipbuilding had already become. Before anyone thought to move an obelisk at all, these were not modest coastal traders. These were ships built to cross the open sea heavy, with tens of thousands of measures of wheat built with multiple decks and towering masts and populations of sailors and passengers that could number in the hundreds, ships that in their own age represented the outer edge of what timber and rope and human ingenuity could accomplish. And it was precisely this outer edge that the obelisk ship needed to exceed, though it needed to exceed it in a manner entirely unlike anything the grain ships had ever attempted. A grain ship's genius lay in volume, in the clever use of a deep and rounded hull to swallow as much loose cargo as possible, sacks and jars of wheat that settled and shifted and distributed their weight across the whole of the hold in a manner forgiving of minor imbalance, cargo that could be trimmed and adjusted as the voyage required. The obelisk was nothing like this. It was not volume that needed accommodating, but concentration. A single mass of stone that would not shift, would not settle, would not distribute itself kindly across a hull's belly the way grain would. Every measure of the obelisk's weight bore down through one continuous, unyielding column, and wherever that column rested, the ship beneath it would need to resist not a gradual accumulation of pressure, but an immediate, total, and unmoving burden concentrated along a single line down the length of the keel. This was the paradox that no grain ship, however vast, had ever been built to solve, and it meant that whatever the shipwrights of Alexandria produced would need to depart from the deep-bellied tradition of the grain fleet and take on a different shape altogether, low where the grain ships were tall, broad where they curved. Built not to embrace a great volume of shifting cargo, but to cradle, stubbornly and without flexing, a single point of overwhelming and unmoving weight. The solution the shipwrights arrived at, as best as later reconstruction and the surviving descriptions allow us to understand it, was a hull built low in the water and unusually broad across the beam, a vessel that traded the height and capacious curves of the grain ships for a flatter, wider profile that could seat the obelisk along its centerline and spread the pressure of that single stone shaft across the greatest possible length of keel and the greatest possible breadth of hull. It was an old principle, understood by anyone who had ever tried to carry a heavy and rigid object rather than a soft or shifting one, that stability came not from height but from breadth, not from depth but from a low center of gravity, and the shipwrights, drawing on the same instinct that had let their forebears calculate the trim of a grain ship down to the placement of a single sack, now applied that same hard-won intuition to a burden unlike any they had carried before. The keel itself would need to be a marvel in its own right, a timber or an assembly of timbers strong enough to bear in an unbroken line the compressive weight of stone that had stood upright in Egypt for over a millennium before anyone thought to lay it down. None of this could be accomplished without timber, and the gathering of timber for a hull of this scale was its own undertaking, one that drew on forests far beyond the boundaries of Egypt itself, for Egypt, fertile as it was in grain, was notoriously poor in wood suited to shipbuilding. The great cedars that shipwrights across the Mediterranean prized above all other timber grew not along the Nile, but in the mountains to the north and east in the forests of the Levant. And it was to these forests, and to the merchants and agents who could secure their yield, that the builders of the Obelisk ship would have needed to turn. It offered what the hull required: long, straight grain resistant to rot, a lightness relative to its strength that made it prized for keels and hull planking across 1,000 years of Mediterranean shipbuilding before this project ever began. Pine, too, would have played its part for masts and for lesser structural members, and there would have been careful selection even within these species, master shipwrights walking among stacked and seasoned logs the way a sculptor considers a block of marble, looking for the particular grain and density that would serve a keel, meant to bear a burden no keel had likely borne before. The labour of the yard itself, once the timber arrived, was a labour of scale and repetition, of teams of workers hauling and shaping and fitting planks under the direction of master shipwrights whose names, if they were ever recorded, have not survived to us, though their skill is evident in the very fact that the ship was built at all and did, eventually, complete its voyage. There would have been sawyers reducing great trunks into usable planks, caulkers preparing the pitch and fibre that would seal every seam against the sea, smiths forging the fastenings that would hold a structure of unprecedented breadth together against the working and flexing of open water. It was, in every practical sense, a shipyard behaving as shipyards had behaved for generations, except that every calculation within it was being pushed toward an extreme that the ordinary demands of trade or war had never required. And here, if one paused long enough amid the noise of that labour to consider what was actually being built, a peculiar stillness settled over the whole enterprise, a quiet recognition of the paradox at its heart. Every other great ship of the ancient world had been built to carry something that moved or that could be moved, whether grain that would be measured out sack by sack, or soldiers who would disembark and march, or oil and wine in jars that could be shifted. This ship was being built to carry stillness itself, a single object that would not be handled, not be adjusted, not be divided into manageable portions, an object whose entire nature was to remain exactly as it had always been, upright and immovable, until the hull beneath it delivered it, whole and unaltered, to a shore 1,000 miles from where it had stood. It was a vessel conceived not to transport cargo in the ordinary sense, but to transport mass and stillness across open water, an engineering paradox dressed in the practical clothing of planking and rope, and the shipwrights of Alexandria, heirs to a tradition of carrying the living wealth of Egypt to a hungry city, now turned that same inherited skill toward carrying something that had no wish, no weight of grain's shifting restlessness, nothing at all but its own unyielding and ancient patience. The keel was laid first, as it always was, and yet even this earliest and most familiar act of shipbuilding carried within it the signature of something unfamiliar. A keel is the spine upon which every rib of a vessel finds its bearing, and the shipwrights who set this one down understood, in the quiet way that craftsmen understand the weight of a task before it is fully spoken aloud, that whatever timber they chose to lay would need to answer for a burden unlike any their hands had shaped a hull to carry before. The wood came from the forests that had long fed the yards of the Mediterranean, cut and seasoned and floated down to the coast in the patient rhythm that shipbuilding had always followed. And yet the length of the pieces required, and the thickness demanded of them, pressed against the very edges of what those forests could easily supply. Longer keel timbers meant older trees, and older trees meant a longer search, and so before a single frame could rise, the search itself became part of the labor, a slow gathering of material suited to a purpose that had not existed until an emperor's want gave it shape. Once the keel lay settled upon its blocks, the frames began to rise from it, in the manner familiar to any who had watched a hull grow from its bones. Rib after rib lifted into place and fixed along the spine, each one slightly different from its neighbor, as the shape of the vessel widened toward its center. But here, again, the ordinary practice bent under the weight of the unusual task. The frames of this hull needed to be raised wider and heavier than those of any grain carrier that had come before, for the vessel was not merely to carry a great deal of weight, but to carry it all in a single unmoving mass set low and firm within the hold, a demand utterly unlike the loose, adjustable burden of stacked grain, sacks that could shift and settle without threatening the balance of the ship around them. A granary ship might list a little and right itself as its cargo resettled with the motion of the sea. A ship built to carry a single stone shaft of such length could not depend on any such gentle accommodation. If the load leaned, the ship leaned with it, and there would be no correction offered by the cargo itself, no small mercy of grain finding its own level. The frame had to be built to hold a fixed and immovable idea, and shipwrights who had spent their working lives calculating for shift and give now found themselves calculating instead for absolute rigidity, for a hull that could resist the temptation of the sea to tip what refused to be tipped back. The planking that followed the frame raising was, by the accounts that survive in fragments, and by the inferences later historians have drawn from them, unusually thick-layered, with the kind of patient redundancy that shipwrights use when they distrust the ordinary margins of safety. Each plank was set and caulked with the pitch and fiber that Mediterranean builders had used for centuries, driven into every seam with mallets and iron tools, until the hull held water out as stubbornly as it would soon be asked to hold an obelisk in. The caulking of a ship of this size was not a brief labor. It was days upon days of men working along the curve of the hull, packing the seams, testing them, packing them again, for a leak in an ordinary vessel might be a nuisance managed by pumps and patience, but a leak in a hull, bearing a load with no ability to lighten itself, was a danger of a different order altogether. The ship could not be made lighter in a crisis. Whatever went in at Alexandria had to come out whole at Rome, and so every seam had to be trusted absolutely before the obelisk was ever brought near the water. It was Pliny, writing generations after the ship had done its single great labor and vanished into the historical record, as little more than a marvel recalled in passing, who left behind the detail that later ages would seize upon with something like gratitude, for so much of this story survives only in outline, the shape of an event, rather than its substance. And here, suddenly, there is a number. Pliny recorded that the ship carried as ballast a great quantity of lentils, said to amount to some 120,000 measures, packed into the hold to steady a vessel that would otherwise have ridden the sea unevenly, top-heavy with its single stone burden and unbalanced in a way no ordinary cargo would have produced. It is a strange and oddly tender detail to have survived from an age that recorded so little of the practical texture of shipbuilding. This image of legumes packed by the countless measure into the belly of a ship built to carry a monument to the sun. And yet it is exactly the kind of detail that a Roman writer, alert to the odd and the memorable, would have thought worth preserving precisely because it seemed so incongruous beside the grandeur of the obelisk itself. A monument cut from Aswan granite, dragged across a continent's worth of desert and river, carried now not merely by timber and rope, but cushioned, in some very real sense, by a hold full of ordinary food. The reasoning behind such ballast becomes clear enough once one considers the peculiar physics of the vessel's burden. An obelisk, unlike grain or oil or wine, could not be distributed. It occupied a fixed place within the hold, its great weight concentrated along a single, unmoving line, and unless the rest of the ship's mass was arranged to counter that concentration, the vessel would sit unevenly in the water, prone to listing and vulnerable to the rolling motion of open sea swells in a way that could threaten both cargo and crew. The lentils packed low and along the length of the hold offered a kind of movable counterweight, cheap, plentiful, and infinitely adjustable in ways that stone could never be. They could be shifted, added, or removed as the loading progressed, allowing the shipwrights and the pilots overseeing the work to fine-tune the vessel's trim in the days before departure, coaxing the great hull toward a balance that no single rigid object could have provided on its own. It was in its way an elegant solution to an inelegant problem, the humble legume pressed into service alongside timber and iron to solve what pure engineering alone could not easily resolve. The ancient accounts that touch upon this ship, sparse as they are, carry within them the trace of difficulty, of a task attempted at the very edge of what the shipbuilders of the age believed possible. There is no surviving record of easy confidence, no boast preserved of a labor accomplished without doubt. What survives instead is the shape of novelty itself, inferred by later historians from the very fact that no ordinary vessel could be pressed into this service, that a hull had to be conceived and built new, purpose-made, for a single act never before attempted in quite this way. Alexandria's shipwrights had carried obelisks before, or so later, writers believed, but never one of this scale, never across open sea, for so great a distance, and never for an emperor whose want brooked no half measures. The difficulty was not merely technical, but psychological, a labor undertaken without the comfort of precedent. Each choice of timber and frame and plank made with only the dim guidance of similar but smaller undertakings to steady the builder's judgment. The physical dimensions of the hull, as later scholars have reconstructed them from the scattered evidence, suggest a vessel of extraordinary beam, wide enough to cradle the obelisk's great length along its center line, while still leaving room enough for the ballast that would counter its weight. The depth of the hold was carried low, deeper than the ordinary grain ship, to keep the center of the load as near the waterline as safety allowed, lowering the vessel's center of gravity and granting it a stability that height alone could never have offered. The rigging above deck, meanwhile, had to answer for a draft far heavier than usual, masts and yards proportioned not merely to catch wind for an ordinary cargo run, but to drive forward a hull sitting low and heavy in the water, sluggish in its turning, demanding patience from every sail set upon it. Each rope, each spar, each plank was in its own quiet way an answer to the single question that had shaped the entire undertaking from its earliest planning. How does one build a vessel not around what it must carry, but around the impossibility of ever adjusting to it once the carrying begins? And, plank by plank, frame by frame, measure of lentil by measure of lentil, the answer took shape upon the Alexandrian shore. The hull itself, once finished, solved only half the riddle. A ship capable of bearing such weight was one achievement. Persuading that weight to come aboard was another matter entirely. And it was here, in the final days before departure, that the true ingenuity of the whole enterprise revealed itself most plainly. The obelisk could not simply be lifted, for no crane of the ancient world, however cleverly rigged with pulleys and counterweights, could raise a shaft of solid granite stretching some 25 meters in height and weighing, by the estimates that have come down through later engineers and historians, somewhere in the range of 300 tons. Lifting was never the method. The stone had to be brought level, or as near level as the harbour allowed, and drawn into position along a path that offered it no chance to tip, no moment where its full mass rested upon a single unsupported point. The likeliest solution, and the one toward which most modern reconstructions lean, involve water itself as the great equalizer of weight. A channel, cut or adapted from an existing basin near the harbour works of Alexandria, would have allowed the specially built vessel to be maneuvered into a fixed position, her hull perhaps partially sunk or ballasted low, so that the obelisk could be drawn onto her not through a vertical lift, but through a controlled, near-horizontal transfer. Sliding the stone along a bed of timber and rollers from a raised platform or ramp on shore directly onto a corresponding structure built into the ship's own deck. Some who have studied the matter believe the ship may have been partially flooded and settled into a purpose-dug basin, so that the obelisk, cradled on its ramp, could be eased across at a height matching the vessel's deckline, after which the ship was gradually pumped or bailed clear of water and allowed to rise beneath its cargo, the load settling into place as the hull lifted around it. It is an elegant solution if it is the correct one, and it would have demanded a harbour engineered as carefully as the ship itself, sluices and channels dug with the same foresight given to the timbers above. Whether or not this particular method was employed in precisely this form, the broader principle it reflects was ancient long before Caligula's reign, and had been proven across centuries of Egyptian stoneworking. The building of the pyramids, the transport of colossal statues along the Nile, the raising of temple pylons at Karnak and Luxor, all rested upon variations of the same fundamental toolkit. Earthen ramps, built at a shallow enough grade to allow controlled movement, rollers of hard wood laid beneath sledges to reduce friction against the ground, and levers employed at critical moments to nudge a resting mass by fractions of an inch. Counterweights too played their part in certain schemes, particularly where a stone needed not merely to be dragged forward, but tilted or rotated into a new position. A system of ropes and weighted baskets, allowing workers to apply force gradually rather than suddenly, easing a shift in balance rather than forcing it. Wet sand, according to some interpretations of tomb paintings depicting similar labours, may have been poured ahead of sledges to reduce resistance further, the moisture binding the ground into a firmer, more even surface than dry sand would allow. None of these methods required forces beyond what teams of men, oxen, and carefully applied mechanical advantage could generate. What they required instead was patience, coordination, and an intimate, almost inherited understanding of how stone behaved under strain, an understanding built through generations of failures, long since forgotten and lost to time. It is worth pausing before returning to the ship herself, to imagine the scene that likely unfolded at the Alexandrian waterworks in the days the loading took place, though it must be said plainly that no single ancient account survived to describe this moment in the detail a modern reader might wish for. What follows, then, is not eyewitness testimony but the plausible shape historians and engineers have assembled from analogous depictions, physical constraints, and the sparse fragments of report that do survive. The harbour at that hour would have carried the ordinary business of a great port even as this singular labour unfolded nearby. And it is possible the surrounding docks continued their usual traffic of grain ships and fishing vessels, their crews perhaps pausing to watch as the strange operation drew the eye. Near the ramp itself, gangs of labourers, likely numbering in the hundreds when one accounts for those hauling ropes, those managing rollers, those responsible for the ramp's structural integrity, and those overseeing the ship's ballast, would have worked under the direction of engineers whose names, in nearly every case, too, have not survived into the historical record. Wooden capstans, if used, would have groaned under tension, as ropes thick as a man's arm were drawn taut, the obelisk's granite bulk resting upon a cradle of timber sledges, greased perhaps, with animal fat or plant oil to ease its passage. The sound of such an operation would have been considerable. The creak of overstressed wood, the rhythmic calls of foremen coordinating the pull, the occasional sharp crack of a roller, giving way beneath the strain and needing swift replacement before the whole assembly lost its balance. Modern engineers who have studied the logistics of this transfer generally agree that whatever the precise arrangement, the operation would have needed to unfold with extraordinary care for a single miscalculation, a roller collapsing unevenly or a rope snapping under unexpected load, shattering the very treasure the entire undertaking existed to preserve, that it did not fall, that the obelisk reached Rome intact and stands today bearing only the wear of 2,000 years of weather, rather than any fracture from its transport, stands as a quiet testament to whatever combination of skill and caution. Some scholars have suggested that a wooden cradle may have been built around the stone itself, distributing its weight across a wider surface and protecting its corners and inscribed surfaces from damage during the roll, a reasonable precaution given how carefully preserved the hieroglyphs remain even now. Others have pointed to the likelihood that the obelisk was moved not by continuous motion, but by a halting incremental process, each advance of a few feet followed by a pause to reposition rollers and retension ropes, the entire journey from ramp to deck, perhaps consuming the better part of several days. It bears repeating, as it must be repeated whenever this episode is discussed, that the precise sequence of methods used cannot be reconstructed with full certainty from the evidence that survives. No technical treatise from the period describes the loading in step-by-step detail, and the historians who mention Caligula's obelisk ship, at all, chief among them Pliny the Elder writing decades later, are more concerned with marveling at the achievement than explaining its mechanics. What can be said is that the general principles at work, ramps, rollers, levers, controlled flooding, or ballasting, were well within the demonstrated capabilities of Roman and Egyptian engineering by the 1st century, and that the scholarly consensus built from comparable projects both earlier and later. Consider some combination of these methods the most plausible explanation for how an object of this scale came to rest safely within a wooden hull. And yet, for all that can be reasoned and reconstructed, something essential remains permanently absent from the record: the names of those who did the actual work. The engineers who calculated the ramp's grade, the foremen who called the rhythm of the pull, the countless laborers, many of them almost certainly enslaved, who strained against ropes and guided rollers beneath a stone that could have crushed any one of them in an instant of misfortune, left no trace of themselves in any surviving text. Pliny records the ship, he does not record the men. Whatever fear or pride or simple exhaustion moved through that harbour in those days has vanished as completely as their names, leaving only the stone itself and the ship built to carry it as evidence that they were ever there at all. It is a peculiar inheritance history often leaves behind, the monument remembered, the maker forgotten, the immense human labour folded silently into the achievement it made possible, visible now only in the fact that the obelisk still stands, and once, impossibly, it moved. And yet the ship itself, though its makers went unnamed, did not go undescribed. Pliny the Elder, writing a generation after the vessel had already been broken down and half forgotten, paused long enough to set its dimensions into the record, and in doing so left later ages the only true portrait we have of what must have been, in its year, the largest ship afloat anywhere in the Mediterranean world. It is worth lingering on that portrait now, deck by deck, plank by plank, in the manner the ancient sources allow and later scholarship has tried patiently to reconstruct, because a ship built for a single purpose and never repeated is a rare thing to hold in the mind, and this one deserves to be seen clearly before its story moves on to the sea. The hull, by the estimates historians have drawn from Pliny's figures, and from the ballast stones, later recovered from the Nemi wrecks and other Caligulan vessels of comparable design, is thought to have run somewhere beyond 110 cubits in length, a measure that in modern terms places her at close to 50 meters from stem to stern, and perhaps wider in the beam than any grain ship or war galley built before her. This was not size for the sake of spectacle alone, though spectacle was certainly part of the emperor's intention. It was size demanded by the cargo, an obelisk of red granite, quarried whole from a single outcrop at Aswan, carried down the Nile centuries earlier to stand at Heliopolis, could not be broken into sections and reassembled at Rome without betraying the very unity that made it sacred. It had to travel as one piece, unbroken, and a single piece of stone. That size, scholars estimate, weighed somewhere in the range of 300 to 400 tons. No ordinary hull, however large, could simply have that weight set down upon its deck and expect to survive the first swell. This is where the ship reveals its most unusual feature, the one that later shipwrights and naval historians have returned to again and again with a kind of professional astonishment. The obelisk was not lashed to the deck as ordinary cargo might be. It was set down along the ship's centerline, running fore and aft through the length of the hull, its base resting not on the upper deck, but driven down through reinforced framing to bear directly upon the keel structure itself, so that the immense dead weight of the stone was carried low near the ship's natural point of balance. Rather than perched high, where it would have made the vessel dangerously top-heavy and prone to capsize in any real sea. To make this possible, the shipwrights are believed to have built the hull around the obelisk from the outset, rather than fitting the stone into a completed vessel. The keel timbers amidships were doubled, likely tripled, laid in overlapping courses of heavy oak, bound and pegged with a density found in no ordinary merchant hull of the period. The frames rising from that keel were set closer together than convention required, closing the gaps that in a normal ship would have been left for lightness and flexibility, because flexibility here was the enemy. A hull built to work slightly with the sea, as most wooden ships were built to do, could not be trusted to hold a single rigid mass of stone without grinding the surrounding timbers to splinters within days. This ship needed to be, in effect, less a ship and more a floating cradle, stiff through the midsection, in a way naval architecture rarely called for, and only flexible, again toward the bow and stern, where the ordinary business of moving through water still had to be managed. Above this reinforced spine, the sources suggest a broad, low working deck, wide enough to give the crew clear passage along both sides of the covered stone. Since the obelisk itself, wrapped and cradled, is thought to have occupied a channel or trench built into the deck structure rather than sitting exposed atop it, both to lower its center of gravity further and to shield it from the salt spray that could, over the length of a long voyage, begin to erode even granite's patient surface. Ballast. And here the Nemi ship excavations of the 20th century have given historians useful comparison, would have been packed deep in the bilge in enormous quantities, not merely to trim the vessel level, but to counteract the tendency of so much weight, however well placed, to roll the hull with each swell. Some estimates drawn from Pliny's remark that the ship also carried several hundred tons of lentils as ballast on its return voyage, a detail so specific it has intrigued historians for centuries, suggests the builders used cheap, dense, replaceable cargo as trim ballast, precisely because a voyage like this one could not risk fixed stone ballast shifting or cracking under the strain the way the obelisk itself must never be allowed to. The sail plan, by the evidence of Roman grain ships of similar tonnage and by the practical requirement of managing so cumbersome a vessel, is believed to have centered on a single great mainmast stepped forward of amidships, carrying an enormous square sail, likely supplemented by a smaller foresail on a raked bowsprit to aid steering. In the manner common to the largest grain carriers of the Alexandrian trade, there is no strong evidence for multiple masts of the kind later galleons would carry, and most historians agree that speed was never the design's concern. A ship burdened this heavily was never meant to run before a strong wind or cut sharply across a headwind. It was meant to be managed, coaxed, nursed across open water at a pace that would have felt, to any sailor accustomed to swifter craft, almost unbearably slow. And this brings the portrait to the crew, whose experience aboard this vessel must have differed sharply from ordinary seafaring life in the Roman world. No log of their voyage survives, no captain's name, no roster of oarsmen or riggers, but the physical requirements of the ship itself allow a reasonable picture to be drawn. Sailing a vessel carrying this much fixed, immovable weight meant sailing cautiously in nearly every sense. A sailor of the period would have understood the word. Storms that a lighter ship might ride out with sail, reduced and sea room to maneuver, would have posed a far graver threat to a hull whose center of mass could not shift, could not be jettisoned, could not be adjusted to compensate for a sudden list. The crew, then, would have hugged the coastline where possible, watched the sky with a particular wariness of men who knew their vessel had no room for error and likely waited out threatening weather in harbour, rather than risk open water with cargo that could neither be secured tighter nor released at all. The pace of the whole voyage, from Alexandria to the Italian coast, which for an ordinary grain ship might take several weeks under favourable winds, is believed by most historians to have stretched considerably longer for this vessel, not from any single mishap, but from the accumulated caution such a voyage demanded at every stage, every questionable sky, every strait or shoal requiring careful sounding before commitment. It was this scale and this singular cargo that led ancient writers to place the Obelisk ship in company with a small and celebrated group of vessels remembered as wonders of engineering rather than mere transport. Pliny himself invites the comparison, noting the ship in the same breath as the great ceremonial vessels built for Ptolemaic Egypt centuries before, floating palaces such as the legendary Thalamegos built for Ptolemy IV, or the immense war galley attributed to Ptolemy IV's predecessors. Ships whose size had already passed into a kind of maritime legend by Caligula's time. To be spoken of alongside those vessels was, in the Roman imagination, to be placed among the very small number of ships built not for war or commerce in any ordinary sense, but for the demonstration of what human ambition and engineering could accomplish when a ruler wished it done regardless of cost. The comparison was not idle. It marked, in the minds of those who made it, a recognition that this was not simply a large cargo ship, but something closer to a monument in its own right, built to carry a monument, floating testimony to power. In its own moment then, before it ever left harbour, before a single length of Egyptian coastline slipped past its rail, the vessel already held a singular distinction. It was, by the measure of every ship known to be afloat anywhere in the Mediterranean world in that year, the largest vessel upon the water, a floating structure built around a single piece of stone with such care and such reinforcement that it briefly outsized every warship of the Roman fleet, every grain carrier of the Alexandrian route, every ceremonial barge remembered from the Egyptian courts before it. It held that distinction for the length of one voyage, built for a purpose that would never need repeating, a giant summoned into being to solve a single problem, and then, its work done, destined to be dismantled and forgotten in nearly every detail, but the load it once carried, and the fact, plain and enduring, that it made the impossible crossing at all. The route it would take was, in its broad outline, no mystery at all. Ships had been sailing between Alexandria and the ports of Italy for generations by the time this vessel was made ready, and the lanes they followed were among the most travelled in the ancient world. Grain from Egypt fed Rome, and had done so since the province first fell under Roman rule. its harvests loaded onto broad-bellied carriers that made the crossing season after season, following the same currents, watching for the same headlands, trusting the same stars when the coast fell away and there was nothing but water. It was this route, well-worn and thoroughly known, that the Obelisk ship would follow out from the harbour at Alexandria along the coast until the safest crossing point presented itself, and then out into open water towards Sicily or the southern shore of Italy, before turning north for Ostia, the great harbour town that served as Rome's door to the sea. The Obelisk ship did not need to discover a path. It needed only to survive the one already known, carrying a burden no grain ship had ever been asked to carry. That burden changed everything about the crossing, even on a route grown familiar through long use. A grain ship, however heavily laden, distributed its cargo across the width and length of the hull, sacks and jars settling into the curve of the bilge. Weight spread wide enough that the vessel answered the sea's movements in the way its builders intended. The Obelisk ship carried a single mass of stone lashed down the center line, a load that could not shift to compensate for a swell, could not be repacked if the ship began to answer the waves unevenly, could not be trimmed the way flexible cargo could be trimmed when a captain felt the balance turning wrong beneath his feet. Every rope and every timber built to cradle that stone had been designed for exactly this problem. But design on a shipwright's plans and design tested against open water are not always the same thing, and there is no way to know from anything that survives how closely the ship performed to what her builders intended once she left the shelter of the harbour and met the first real swell of the crossing. The greater danger lay above the waterline more than below it. A hull heavily weighted with cargo, held low and evenly distributed, can ride a following sea with something like grace, the weight working with the water rather than against it. But an obelisk, however carefully cradled, rose high above the deck, and a mast raised alongside it to aid the loading would only have added to the burden aloft. Whatever the final configuration of masts and rigging on the crossing itself, the plain physical truth is that a tall, narrow, singular weight raised above a hull's center of gravity makes that hull more vulnerable to rolling than a broad, low cargo ever could. Sailors have always understood this instinctively, long before anyone wrote the mathematics of stability into books, and there is no reason to think the captain of this ship understood it any less. Every choice made in loading and lashing the stone, every additional beam wedged beneath the cradle, every extra length of rope run taut across the deck was a hedge against the ship rolling too far in a crosswind and never righting herself again. The margin for error was thin. A sudden squall, a misjudged following sea, a night crossing where the swell could not be seen before it struck the hull, any of these might have ended the voyage in a way that left no obelisk standing in Rome at all, no story to tell, nothing but a name lost among the countless ships the Mediterranean has swallowed without leaving a trace. It is worth pausing, honestly, on how little is actually known about the voyage itself. No log survives describing the days at sea, no captain's account naming the weather encountered off the Sicilian coast or the anxious nights spent watching the stone's lashings hold or slacken with the roll of the ship. Chote. The historians of the period who mention the obelisk's arrival in Rome are concerned chiefly with the fact of its arrival, and with the ship that carried it as an object of wonder to be described after the fact. Its size and construction remembered because they were remarkable, not because anyone thought to record the day-to-day experience of the men who sailed it. This gap is not unusual for ancient seafaring. The vast majority of ordinary voyages, and even a great many extraordinary ones, passed without leaving behind a written account of their daily conduct. What survives is the outcome, and from the outcome, historians and modern sailors alike have had to reconstruct with appropriate caution what the passage might have entailed. The honest answer is that no one now can say exactly how many days the crossing took, whether the ship hugged the coast more closely than the standard grain route allowed for extra safety, whether escort vessels traveled alongside her for the entire distance or only through the most exposed stretches, or whether there were moments when the crew feared they might lose the cargo, the ship, or both. What can be said is only that the ship arrived, that the obelisk arrived with it, and that somewhere in the space between those two facts lies an entire voyage whose particulars have simply not come down to us. And yet the imagination need not invent facts to conjure something of what that crossing must have looked like from a distance, from another ship's deck, or from the shore as the vessel passed within sight of land. Picture her against the flat blue plate of the open Mediterranean, her hull riding low under the stone's great weight, her silhouette utterly unlike anything else moving across that water in her day. Beside her, the grain ships and coastal traders that shared the sea lanes would have looked almost toy-like, their masts modest, their decks unremarkable, their cargo invisible beneath closed hatches. The obelisk ship carried her burden in the open, a shape rising above the deck that no covering could disguise, a single dark line of stone visible for a great distance across calm water, catching what light there was at dawn or dusk in a way that no ordinary cargo ever could. Any sailor who passed her at a distance, whether Roman, Greek, or Egyptian, would have known at a glance that this was no ordinary transport. She would have looked, from any distance at all, like something the sea itself was struggling to carry, a shape too large and too strange for the modest scale of everything around her. Her escort vessels, if she had any, reduced to the size of gulls, trailing a great, slow-moving whale. There is something in that image worth sitting with for a moment before the story moves on. A ship built for one voyage, carrying one object, crossing a sea traveled by thousands of vessels a year, and yet standing utterly apart from all of them, recognizable not by a flag or a name, but by the sheer improbability of her silhouette. The ordinary ships of the Alexandria run existed to be interchangeable, one grain carrier much like another, their individuality mattering less than the reliable repetition of their voyages, year after year, cargo after cargo. The obelisk ship existed for the opposite reason. She was built to be unrepeatable, to do a thing exactly once, and then to disappear from the routine of the sea lanes as completely as she had briefly dominated them. For the length of one crossing, this single vessel outsized and outweighed every other hull moving across that stretch of water. And then, her purpose achieved, she would fade back into whatever ordinary use or slow dismantling awaited her, leaving behind only the memory of her passing and the stone she had carried. Whether the crossing took a week or considerably longer, whether the weather cooperated or turned difficult somewhere off the coast of Sicily, whether the crew reached Ostia with nerves worn thin from watching the lashings hold through rough water, or arrived instead on a run of calm days that made the whole voyage feel almost uneventful, the ship did arrive. That fact alone tells us that whatever dangers attended the crossing were managed. Whatever design decisions had gone into the reinforced keel and the lowered center of gravity and the careful placement of the load, did their work well enough to bring an emperor's want safely across open water. It is a quiet kind of triumph, unwitnessed by history in any of its particulars, and yet entirely real for being undocumented. The stone reached Italy. The ship that carried it had done what no vessel before it had needed to do, and in doing so had earned, however briefly, a place among the largest and strangest ships the ancient Mediterranean. And yet reaching Rome's harbour was only the beginning of the difficulty. The port of Ostia had grown accustomed, over centuries, to receiving the wealth of an empire. Grain from Africa, marble from Greece, timber from the northern provinces, wine and oil, and slaves and silver, all of it passed through the harbour's mouth in a steady procession that had long since become routine to the men who worked the docks. But nothing in that long history had prepared Ostia for a single object weighing near 400 tons, resting in the belly of a ship built for no other purpose than to carry it there and then, having arrived to be entirely useless again. The harbour itself may not have been ready in the form. Later generations would come to know it. Claudius Caligula's successor would soon undertake the great harbour works that eventually bore his name, expanding Ostia's capacity to receive exactly this kind of impossible cargo. Whether the obelisk arrived before or during those improvements remains a matter that the sources do not settle with any confidence. And where the record is thin, the honest course is to say so rather than to invent a certainty the evidence cannot support. What can be said is that the ship, however it came to rest in Roman waters, now faced a task in some ways more delicate than the crossing itself. It had carried its burden across open sea without losing it to the deep. Now that burden had to be brought ashore, transferred from a floating hull to solid ground, without the accident that had haunted every mile of the voyage, finally catching up with the stone at the very last step. The likely method, as reconstructed by those who have studied the era's engineering practices, was the same technology that had loaded the obelisk in Egypt, now run in reverse. A ramp built of earth and timber angled down from the quay into the shallows where the ship had been drawn as close to shore as her draft allowed. Levers, ropes, and the patient application of enormous but carefully distributed force did the work that no single method alone could accomplish. Where in Egypt the obelisk had been eased down into the ship's hold along a sloped bed of packed earth, here the sequence reversed itself, the great shaft eased upward and outward from the hull, resting always on some prepared surface, never for a moment allowed to bear its full weight on a single, unsupported point. It is worth pausing on how little margins such an operation allowed. A rope under too much strain does not warn before it parts. A lever set at the wrong angle does not announce its failure gently. The obelisk, once in motion, possessed a momentum that no team of men, however numerous, could simply halt by strength of arm. Every stage of the unloading required that the forces in play be calculated, or at least intuited through generations of accumulated craft before the stone ever began to move. The margin between success and catastrophe was not measured in comfortable distances. It was measured in inches, in the give of a rope, in the settling of timber under load. And once ashore, the obelisk's journey was still not finished. It had to be moved from the harbour at Ostia to its final resting place within the city of Rome itself, a distance of some miles, over roads never designed to bear a single object of such concentrated weight. The details of this overland transport do not survive in any account precise enough to reconstruct with confidence. What can be inferred from the general practices of Roman engineering, and from the sheer physical requirements of the task, is that it likely proceeded much as the loading in Egypt had proceeded. Rollers laid before the stone's path, ropes attached at calculated points, teams of men and likely draft animals hauling in coordinated effort. The whole procession advancing not in a single triumphant march, but in the halting, incremental way that such loads must always travel. A few feet gained, the rollers repositioned, the ropes reset, and the process begun again. Rome's engineers had built roads capable of bearing armies and supply trains for centuries. Whether those same roads without modification could bear the passage of a single object weighing as much as several loaded wagons together is a question the sources leave open, and reasonable historians have suggested that some manner of temporary reinforcement, some laying of additional timber or stone along the route, would have been necessary to prevent the obelisk's passage from simply breaking the road beneath it. The destination for all this labor was the site that would come to be known in later centuries by its association with a different and more infamous emperor. Caligula had begun construction of a circus in the district along the Vatican Hill on the western side of the Tiber, a private pleasure ground for chariot racing that lay outside the crowded heart of the city. It was here, at the long central barrier known as the Spina, the raised strip around which racing chariots would circle, that the obelisk was ultimately erected. The circus itself would later pass into greater notoriety under Nero, whose association with the site would come to overshadow, in popular memory, the fact that it was Caligula who had first commissioned both the racing ground and the obelisk that stood within it. The history of the place would in time entangle itself with darker stories, tales of persecution and spectacle that belong more properly to Nero's reign than to Caligula's. But the stone itself predates all of that later notoriety, standing simply as a marker of one emperor's want fulfilled at extraordinary cost. Now, planted in Roman soil, far from the temple precinct where it had stood for a millennium and a half, the raising of the obelisk into its upright position at the Spina represents perhaps the final and most delicate stage of the entire undertaking. To bring a stone of that mass from a horizontal resting position to a vertical standing one, without the aid of any mechanical advantage beyond ropes, timber, and human and animal muscle, was an engineering problem of the first order. The most plausible method, drawing on later Roman practice recorded by writers such as Ammianus Marcellinus in his account of subsequent obelisk transports, involved the construction of an elaborate scaffold of timber built up around the base where the stone was to stand, with a system of ropes and windlasses arranged to draw the shaft upward by degrees as it pivoted around its base. Hundreds of men would have been required at the capstans and windlasses, their combined effort translated through the ropes into the slow, controlled rotation of a stone shaft rising from the earth, like something ancient and reluctant being coaxed back into wakefulness. The men who performed this labor left no names behind them. They are not recorded in any inscription, remembered in no epitaph, celebrated in no verse. They were almost certainly slaves and hired laborers, the anonymous workforce that Roman engineering projects of every kind depended upon and rarely acknowledged, their sweat and their occasional deaths absorbed into the finished monument without comment. The overseers, the engineers who calculated the angles and the loads and the timing of the ropes, were doubtless more educated men, versed in the mathematics and mechanics that Roman military and civil engineering had developed to a high degree of sophistication. But even their names, in the case of this particular obelisk, do not survive. What remains is only the stone itself and the fact of its standing, evidence of labor and skill and calculated risk that history has otherwise declined to preserve in any personal detail. When at last the obelisk stood upright at the Spina of Caligula's circus, it became something it had never been in Egypt. Not a monument to Egyptian religious cosmology, addressed to a sun god in a language of hieroglyphs that Roman spectators could not read, but a trophy of empire. A demonstration that Rome's reach extended to the ends of the known world, and that even the most immovable relics of conquered lands could be brought to stand within sight of the emperor's own pleasures. It would remain there, at that spot, for centuries, watching chariots race around the track it marked, watching the circus pass through Nero's reign and beyond, watching the slow transformation of the district around it as Rome's history unfolded through crisis. Through the decline of the empire in the West, and the rise of new powers that would eventually claim the same ground for entirely different purposes. Through all of it, the obelisk stood as a kind of silent witness, indifferent to the change of regimes in the way that only stone, brought so far and at such cost, can afford to be. It had already outlived the civilization that built it. It would go on, in the centuries to come, to outlive the empire that had stolen it away. It is worth pausing here before returning to the ship itself to consider what kind of vessel this actually was in the wider company of the ancient world's great hulls, because the ship that carried the obelisk from Alexandria to Rome did not stand entirely alone in the imagination of antiquity, even if it stood nearly alone in its purpose. There had been other legendary ships before it, vessels whose size and ambition had already passed into story by the time Caligula's engineers laid their keel. Chief among them was the Syracusia, built 2 centuries earlier under the patronage of Hiero II of Syracuse, a ship so large and so laden with luxury that, according to the accounts that survive, it required modification of its own harbours to be launched and eventually sailed only once to Alexandria, too costly and too unwieldy to maintain as a working vessel. The Syracusia was said to have carried gardens, a gymnasium, a library, and a temple to Aphrodite within its hull. Ship built less to move cargo efficiently than to demonstrate what human ingenuity could achieve when cost was no object and purpose bent entirely to spectacle. In this, it shared something essential with the Obelisk ship, though the 2 vessels served almost opposite functions. Where the Syracusia was a floating palace, meant to be inhabited and admired, the Obelisk ship was closer to a floating cradle, a vessel whose entire architecture existed to serve a single piece of cargo that could neither be modified nor accommodated by ordinary means. Rome itself, quite apart from these singular marvels, had long since developed an entire class of ships built for one recurring purpose that came close to matching the ambition, if not the singularity, of the Obelisk vessel. The grain ships that sailed each year from Alexandria to Ostia were themselves objects of wonder to those who encountered them, so large that the philosopher Lucian, writing perhaps a century after the Obelisk's journey, described boarding one such vessel and marveling at its size, comparing its proportions to those of a small city rather than a ship. These grain haulers, built to carry the wheat that fed Rome's swollen population, were reckoned by some ancient sources to have displaced well over 1,000 tons when fully laden, and modern estimates drawn from the few wrecks that have been partially surveyed and from the descriptions that survive in literary sources tend to support the idea that ships of this class were among the largest working vessels of the ancient Mediterranean, sailing the same waters the Obelisk ship would have crossed, and serving the same city that would eventually raise the obelisk itself. But even these grain ships, remarkable as they were, had been built for a repeating task, refined and repaired and sent out again each season, their hulls representing an investment meant to be recouped across years of service. The Obelisk ship, by every account and every reasonable inference historians have drawn from the descriptions of Pliny the Elder, who wrote of the ship not many decades after it made its crossing, appears to have served no such repeated function. It was raised, it made its single celebrated voyage carrying its single stone, and its subsequent history, so far as it can be reconstructed, did not include a return to the grain trade or a second life ferrying obelisks or any other outsized cargo across the sea. This was, even by the standards of a civilization inclined toward grand and costly gestures, an unusual way to spend the resources that shipbuilding required. Timber of the kind and quantity needed for a hull of this scale was neither cheap nor easily gathered, and the labor of shipwrights skilled enough to frame a vessel meant to bear such a concentrated and unbalanced load represented a rare and valuable resource in its own right. To commit all of this to a single non-repeating purpose was the kind of decision that only an emperor, and perhaps only an emperor already inclined toward extravagant demonstrations of power, would have found reasonable. It fits, in this sense, into a broader pattern that becomes visible when the Obelisk ship is set alongside the other great engineering projects of the Roman world during this period and the decades that followed. The aqueducts that would eventually stretch for scores of miles across the Italian countryside, carried on arches that dwarfed the buildings around them, were built not simply to solve the practical problem of moving water, but to announce in stone and span the capacity of Roman engineering to bend the landscape to human need. The amphitheatres that rose in the capital and across the provinces, structures capable of holding tens of thousands of spectators and of flooding their own arenas for the staging of naval battles, existed for reasons that were entertainment and public administration in equal measure, built to be seen and marvelled at as much as they were built to be used. The Obelisk ship belongs unmistakably to this same tradition of engineering as spectacle, even though its audience was in the end smaller and more fleeting than the crowds who would fill an amphitheatre for a single afternoon. Its audience was the harbour at Alexandria watching it depart, the ports along its route where it may have called or been sighted, and the crowds at Ostia and along the banks of the Tiber who would have gathered to see the impossible arrive. What makes the Obelisk ship historically distinct from the aqueducts and amphitheatres that shared its era of engineering ambition, however, is precisely its singularity of purpose, and the fact that almost nothing built for a single non-repeating task in the ancient world tends to survive in any form for later ages to examine. An aqueduct, once built, continued to carry water, and therefore continued to be maintained, repaired, and in some cases still stands today, functioning testimony to the labor that raised it. An amphitheater, similarly, remained useful and was cared for across centuries, its stone reused or its structure preserved, because it continued to serve a purpose long after the individuals who built it had died. A ship built for one voyage and one cargo, by contrast, faced no such ongoing incentive for preservation. Once the obelisk had been unloaded and raised in its new home, the ship that had carried it became, in the coldest practical terms, a very large and very oddly configured hull with no clear continuing use. Ships of unusual design, built for cargoes that would never be repeated, tended in the ancient world to be broken up for their timber, left to rot at their moorings, or in rare cases repurposed for some entirely different function that erased the traces of their original construction. This is precisely why so few of history's legendary single-purpose vessels have left behind any physical evidence at all. The Syracusia, gifted away, and eventually vanishing from the historical record, entirely left nothing behind but Athenaeus' second-hand description of a lost work by Motion, a text describing a ship no archaeologist has ever found and probably never will. The grain ships, despite their numbers and their importance to Roman survival, exist today mostly as scattered wreck sites, identified by their cargo of amphorae rather than by any surviving structural evidence of the hulls themselves. Since wood decays, and the particular characteristics that would mark a vessel as a grain hauler rather than any other kind of merchant ship are not easily read from a scatter of broken pottery on the seafloor. Against this pattern of near-total loss, the fate of the obelisk ship stands out as something unusual, and it is this unusual afterlife, quietly foreshadowed even in Pliny's brief account of the vessel's construction, that gives this particular ship its distinct place in the record of history, rather than consigning it to the same fog of literary description and physical absence that swallowed the Syracusia and so many of Rome's ambitious merchant fleet. Because the ship built to carry Caligula's obelisk did not simply vanish once its singular task was complete. It was not, so far as later evidence would eventually show, broken apart for its timber or left to rot quietly at some forgotten mooring along the Tiber. Instead, it found a second purpose, one that Pliny himself gestures toward, and that later archaeology would confirm in a manner few could have anticipated. A purpose that would preserve fragments of its structure for nearly 2,000 years, in a form far more durable than wood alone could ever have achieved on its own. Before turning to the obelisk's long and eventful standing in Rome across the centuries that followed, it is this fate of the ship itself, this strange and unexpected second life given to a vessel that seemed destined by every convention of the age to disappear without trace, that deserves attention next because it explains why. Of all the great ships of antiquity, this is one of the very few whose actual timbers a modern hand has been able to touch. By the time the obelisk stood upright on its new pedestal in the gardens beside the Vatican Hill, the emperor who had commanded its journey was already dead, struck down by his own guard in a corridor of the palace he had built to house his vanity. And the ship that had carried the stone across the width of the Mediterranean now belonged to no one in particular. It had been built for a single purpose, conceived and laid down, and launched for the sole task of bearing one impossible weight from one shore to another. And that task was now complete. There is a particular fate that awaits vessels of this kind, ships raised not for a career of trade or war, but for one specific, unrepeatable errand. And it is rarely a fate that involves further voyages. A hull shaped around the needs of a single cargo does not easily find new work. Its proportions are wrong for anything else. Its hold, built to cradle a single unyielding mass, does not lend itself to sacks of grain or jars of oil or the ordinary business of Mediterranean trade. And so the ship that had carried Caligula's obelisk sat in the years after his death as a kind of orphaned monument, too strange and too specific to be useful, too large and too well built to simply abandon. The task of deciding what became of it fell not to Caligula, who had never troubled himself with the question of afterward, but to his uncle and successor, Claudius, a man remembered by history in far kinder terms than his predecessor, and one who inherited not only the empire, but a great many of its unfinished ambitions. Among these was a project that Caligula himself had apparently begun to imagine before his death, though it would fall to Claudius to see it through. The construction of a new harbour at Portus, a few miles up the coast from the old port of Ostia, where the silting of the Tiber's mouth had long made the anchoring of large grain ships a hazardous and uncertain business. Rome's hunger for imported grain, shipped in from Egypt and North Africa in vessels nearly as large as the one that had carried the obelisk, had outgrown what Ostia's shallow and exposed roadstead could safely accommodate. Ships waited offshore in weather that could turn without warning, and more than one had been lost within sight of land, their cargoes and crews gone in the sort of sudden Mediterranean storm that ancient sailors feared above all else. Claudius, whatever else might be said of him, understood infrastructure. He set about building a harbour that would finally give Rome's shipping the shelter it required. A great artificial basin enclosed by two long curving moles reaching out into the sea, with a lighthouse rising from an island at the entrance to guide vessels safely in. It is here, in the ancient accounts that survive from this period, that the obelisk ship reappears, and the return is not a triumphant one. Pliny the Elder, writing decades later with the same appetite for curious detail that led him to record the ship's original dimensions, notes that the vessel was eventually sunk deliberately, employed as part of the foundation for the mole that would shelter the new harbour at Portus. The great hull, built with such deliberate excess of timber and iron to bear the weight of Egyptian granite, was filled with a mass of concrete and rubble, towed or manoeuvred into position at the harbour works, and allowed to settle into the silt of the seabed, where it would serve not as a vessel any longer, base upon which the engineers of the new harbour could build outward and upward with confidence that the foundation beneath their masonry would not shift or wash away. There is something quietly startling in this when it is turned over slowly in the mind. A ship built for spectacle, constructed to carry the personal ambition of an emperor who wanted all of Rome to look up and marvel, ends its working life buried beneath the practical, unglamorous stonework of a harbour mole, doing labour that required no audience at all. No crowds gathered to watch the ship sink into the silt at Portus the way they had gathered, presumably, to watch it arrive at the mouth of the Tiber laden with its obelisk years before. There is no surviving account of a ceremony, no record of anyone marking the moment with a kind of reverence that had attended the ship's earlier achievements. It simply went down, deliberately and without apparent regret, into the mud of a harbour that Caligula had never lived to see completed, transformed from the most singular vessel in the Roman world into an anonymous component of a much larger and more permanent structure, one whose builders likely thought of the sunken hull, if they thought of it at all, purely in terms of its usefulness as ballast and foundation, rather than as the vessel that had once carried the largest single stone ever to cross the sea. And yet, this transformation, however unceremonious, was not without its own peculiar logic, one that Roman engineers of the period understood well. The reuse of large decommissioned ships as ballast or foundation material for harbour works was not, so far as the ancient sources allow us to judge, an unusual practice, nor was it considered wasteful. A hull too large and too specialized for ordinary service, but too well built and too solid to simply break apart for its timber, presented engineers with a useful problem rather than a discarded curiosity. Filled with rubble, stone and pozzolana concrete, of the kind the Romans had perfected for underwater construction, a sunken hull became an immovable weight, precisely suited to anchoring the enormous stone blocks and concrete caissons of a harbour mole against the constant working of waves and current. Wood that had once needed to flex and answer to the sea now simply needed to sit heavy and still, holding its position against whatever the water pressed against it. In this sense, the obelisk ship's very construction, the doubled planking, the packed layers of lead sheathing, the deliberate excess of timber built into every rib and keel plank to bear the strain of its impossible cargo, made it in a strange way perfectly suited to this final purpose. The same qualities that had allowed it to carry an eternal stone across open water now allowed it to serve, buried and unmoving, as the foundation for a work meant to endure for centuries. There is a kind of symmetry in this that the Romans themselves may not have paused to articulate, but that becomes visible with the distance of 2,000 years. The obelisk had been carved to honor the eternity of the Egyptian sun, raised at Heliopolis to stand as a fixed point beneath a sky that itself seemed unchanging. The ship built to carry it, by contrast, had been made for motion, for a single crossing of open water, its entire purpose bound up in the temporary drama of transport. And yet it was the ship, not the stone, that in the end became the more literally permanent structure, sunk and buried and left to hold its position beneath the silt of Portus, while the obelisk itself would be moved again and again in the centuries that followed, toppled, buried, rediscovered, and re-erected more than once before its final placement in the square where it now stands. Vessel that had seemed, by every ordinary measure, the more perishable of the two, one built of wood and destined by the conventions of its age to rot, burn, or simply wear away into nothing, became instead the more stationary of the pair, anchored into the fabric of the harbour at Portus in a way that the restless stone it had once carried never was. It is worth pausing before moving on to trace the obelisk's own long and eventful history in Rome, to imagine the actual moment of that sinking, so far as the imagination, guided carefully by what the sources allow, can reconstruct it. The hull, stripped by then of whatever rigging and fittings might still have been useful elsewhere, filled deliberately with stone and rubble, and the heavy grey concrete that Roman engineers trusted to set even underwater, would have settled low in the water of the harbour basin, no longer answering readily to the movement of the sea the way a living ship does, but sitting instead with the sluggish final weight of something already becoming part of the seabed, rather than part of the world above it. As the water closed over the deck, over whatever ornament or fitting had once marked it as an imperial vessel, the ship would have begun the slow work of settling into the silt, timber, and lead and iron nails, sinking by fractions of an inch, year upon year. It became, in that stillness, something closer to a headland or a reef than to a ship, present but no longer active, holding its place, while the world above it, the emperors, the harbour traffic, the centuries, continued to move. The obelisk it had carried, meanwhile, had no such stillness ahead of it. It stood in the spina of the circus at the foot of the Vatican Hill, and it stood there for a very long time, doing nothing but standing, which was, in its way, a kind of work. A stone does not perform. It only remains. Remaining over the centuries that followed its raising would turn out to be enough to make it a witness to things that no one who set it in place could have anticipated. The circus in the years after Caligula continued to be what it had been built to be, a place of racing and spectacle, and the obelisk stood at the center of it the way it had been designed to stand, mocking the turn of the track, catching the sun at the hour when the chariots ran. But within a few decades of its raising, under the reign of Nero, the circus and the gardens around it became associated with one of the darker episodes of the early empire's relationship with the new religious movement spreading quietly through the city. The accounts that survive, chiefly from the historian Tacitus, describe the persecution of Christians in Rome following the Great Fire of the year 64, a persecution that Tacitus places, at least in part, in Nero's own gardens near the Vatican, with the circus itself named as a site of public executions carried out as spectacle. It is from this tradition, layered over centuries of Christian memory and later elaborated by pious writers, that the belief arose linking this particular circus to the death of the Apostle Peter and by extension to the eventual placement of a basilica and then a much greater basilica on the hill just behind it. The obelisk cannot be shown to have witnessed any single event with certainty. The sources for this period are fragmentary, and later tradition tends to fill gaps with confidence that the original evidence does not fully support. But the correlation of place is not in dispute. The stone stood where these things are said to have happened, close enough that its shadow, at certain hours, would have fallen across the same ground. Whatever it saw or did not see, it stood through what came after. The circus of Caligula fell gradually out of use as the center of imperial spectacle moved to other venues within the city, and the site became less a place of racing than a burial ground. Its association with Christian memory, deepening as chapels and shrines began to accumulate near it. Where the first great basilica of St. Peter was raised in the 4th century under Constantine, the obelisk stood outside this new building to its south, no longer at the center of a racetrack but at the edge of a rising complex of Christian worship, and there it remained for well over 1,000 years, largely undisturbed, while Rome itself underwent transformations that make the fall of the obelisk's own home city, Heliopolis, look almost gentle by comparison. The Western Roman Empire, the state that had raised the stone in the first place, dissolved around it. Rome was sacked more than once. Its population, which had numbered perhaps 1 million at its height, fell by some estimates to a few tens of thousands. A city of ruins and grazing sheep among the broken monuments of its own imperial past. Aqueducts failed. Temples were stripped for building material or converted to new uses, their columns and marble repurposed into churches, their bronze melted down. Through all of this, the obelisk stood, granite being far less useful to a scavenging population than marble or bronze, too solid to break apart with the tools available, too large to move without exactly the kind of specialized engineering that had brought it there in the first place. Its very inconvenience protected it. It had defeated one civilization's engineers to arrive, and it now, in a strange reversal, sat beyond the reach of what remained. It was not entirely forgotten during these centuries. though its history grew steadily less clear to those who passed it. Medieval pilgrims visiting St. Peter's, drawn by the tomb of the apostle believed to lie beneath the new basilica, would have seen the stones standing to the side of the church and offered it their own explanations, some of them fantastical. A persistent tradition held that a bronze ball at its summit contained the ashes of Julius Caesar, a belief with no basis in the historical record, but one repeated for generations, evidence that the obelisk had become by this point less a documented Egyptian monument than a piece of the city's accumulated legend. Its true origin blurred by the centuries between. It stood in this condition, slightly askew from the axis of the church that had grown up around it, through the collapse of the old Constantinian basilica and the slow construction across more than a century of the vast new St. Peter's that would eventually rise in its place. And it was during the final stages of this rebuilding, in the later 16th century, that the obelisk's long stillness finally ended. The decision belonged to Pope Sixtus V, who held the papacy for only a few years, but used them with a builder's urgency, reshaping the streets and monuments of Rome according to a vision of the city as a renewed center of Christian authority. Among his projects was the relocation of the ancient obelisk from its position beside the old basilica to a new position directly in front of the great new church, at the center of what would become St. Peter's Square, where it would stand not as an incidental leftover of pagan antiquity, but as a deliberately reclaimed monument. Its pagan associations absorbed into a Christian setting, a cross eventually placed atop it, in place of whatever ornament the Romans had originally set there. The engineering task this required in the year 1586 was, in its own way, as demanding as anything Caligula's builders had faced with the ship. The stone weighed on the order of 330 tons. It had to be lowered from its ancient base, moved some considerable distance across the square, and raised again into a new foundation, all without breaking a monolith that had already survived more than 3,500 years. The engineer given charge of the project was Domenico Fontana, and the operation he devised drew on a workforce of hundreds of men, dozens of winches, and an arrangement of ropes and capstans coordinated with a discipline that echoed, whether its designers knew it or not. The kind of coordinated labor that had once floated the stone down the Nile and across the Mediterranean in the belly of an emperor's ship. Accounts of the operation describe strict silence enforced around the square during the critical moments of lifting, on pain of death, so that shouted commands could be heard clearly among the ropes and capstans. And a famous, likely embellished, story survives of a sailor in the crowd who broke this silence to shout a warning that the ropes were beginning to smoke and needed water, thereby saving the operation from catastrophe. Whether the story is precisely true or has grown in the telling, the underlying reality it reflects is not exaggerated. Moving a stone of this size and age was a genuine feat, watched by crowds, planned with obsessive care, and completed successfully over the course of many days. When it was done, the obelisk stood once more, this time at the heart of the square that remains, to this day, one of the most recognized public spaces in the world, a Christian cross mounted above a stone cut originally for a pharaoh's temple to the sun, standing now before the seat of a different religious authority entirely. The layers of history compressed into that single shaft of granite are, when set out plainly, almost dizzying. Cut in Egypt under a pharaoh whose name has not survived, attached to it with certainty. Raised at Heliopolis to honor a sun god. Taken by a Roman emperor obsessed with his own divinity. Carried across the sea in a ship built for no other purpose. Raised again at the center of a circus that may have witnessed the death of an apostle. Left standing through the slow collapse of the empire that brought it there. Watched over 1,000 years of medieval legend growing up around its silent form. Moved once more at extraordinary effort, to stand before the great basilica built in that apostle's name. Through every one of these transformations, the ship that carried it did not survive. The vessel that Caligula built for this single purpose was already gone, sunk and settling into harbour mud centuries before Sixtus V's engineers ever laid their ropes across the square. Emperors, religions, empires, entire ways of organizing human life had come and gone in the time between the stone's arrival and its final resting place. And yet the obelisk itself had remained unbroken, continuously present, the one piece of this whole long story that never stopped standing somewhere in the city it had been brought to, watching, in its way, everything that happened around it without a single word. The ship, meanwhile, had no such fortune. Where the obelisk endured in open air, admired and photographed and circled by tourists with their necks craned back, the vessel that carried it had vanished from memory almost entirely, its very existence reduced to a handful of lines in ancient texts, easily doubted, easily dismissed as exaggeration. For close to 19 centuries, no one could say with certainty where the ship had gone, or whether the stories about its size had any truth to them at all. It might have been broken up for timber not long after its final voyage. It might have rotted at anchor in some forgotten corner of a harbour, sinking slowly as its planks gave way until nothing remained above the waterline to mark where it had been. Or it might have been deliberately sunk, its enormous hull repurposed one final time by builders who saw in her bulk not a ship anymore, but simply an enormous quantity of usable structure, ballast, and timber and volume sitting in the water, waiting to be put to some new purpose. It was this last possibility, strange as it sounds, that history would eventually prove correct, though the proof would not arrive until the 20th century and would come almost by accident, in the course of work that had nothing to do with obelisks at all. The story of that rediscovery begins not in Rome itself, but some 20 miles to the southwest, near the modern town of Fiumicino, close to where the Tiber meets the sea. In antiquity, this stretch of coastline had been the site of Portus, the great artificial harbour built under the emperors Claudius and Trajan, to serve as Rome's principal maritime gateway, the place where grain ships from Egypt and Africa unloaded their cargoes for the long journey upriver to the capital. Over the centuries, the coastline had shifted, silted, and changed shape, as coastlines do, and the harbour basins that had once bustled with shipping had long since filled with sediment, buried under fields and marshland, their outlines no longer visible from the surface. By the time archaeologists turned their attention to the area in earnest, Portus existed mostly as a name in old texts and a scattering of ruined walls, its true extent and layout still largely a matter of guesswork. The excavations that would eventually change this picture unfolded gradually across the 20th century, accelerating in its later decades as new techniques and new funding allowed archaeologists to look more closely and more systematically at what lay beneath the ground near Fiumicino. Teams worked through layers of silt and clay that had built up over nearly 2,000 years, uncovering piece by piece the remains of the ancient harbour's infrastructure. Stretches of quay wall, the footings of warehouses, sections of the great hexagonal basin that Trajan had ordered built. To expand the port's capacity, it was patient, unglamorous work, the kind that rarely produces the sudden, cinematic discovery imagined in popular accounts of archaeology, and instead advances through seasons of careful digging, mapping, and recording, with understanding accumulating slowly across years rather than arriving in a single afternoon. It was in the course of this broader excavation of the harbour works that something unexpected began to emerge from beneath one of the ancient foundations, something that did not immediately announce itself as a ship at all. What the archaeologists found, buried and compressed within the structure of a breakwater or mole built to help shelter the harbour, were the surviving timbers of an enormous wooden hull, worked into the foundation itself, deliberately sunk and packed with rubble and stone. The practice was not unheard of in ancient harbour engineering. Old ships, no longer seaworthy, no longer worth the expense of maintaining, were sometimes deliberately scuttled and filled with ballast to create stable platforms on which new stonework could be raised, a way of turning something no longer useful for sailing into something still useful for building. Whoever made this decision about this particular hull, whether out of practical thrift or a kind of grim recognition that the vessel had already served its singular purpose and had no further use as a ship, could not have known that they were placing at the base of a Roman harbour structure. The physical evidence that scholars centuries later would use to confirm one of the strangest stories in the history of ancient engineering. As archaeologists studied the timbers more closely, the scale of what they had found became gradually apparent, and it was the scale, more than anything else, that drew their attention toward the old accounts of Caligula's Obelisk ship. The surviving remains suggested a hull of exceptional size, far larger than the ordinary grain carriers and merchant vessels whose remnants had turned up elsewhere in the harbour excavations. The framing timbers were massive, thick beyond what would have been necessary for a standard cargo vessel, suggesting a structure built to bear an unusually concentrated and unusually heavy load, rather than the more evenly distributed weight of sacks of grain or amphorae of oil. Details of construction, the arrangement of certain structural elements, seem to point toward a vessel designed with a very specific kind of cargo in mind, something requiring reinforcement, not just along its length, but at a particular point within the hull, consistent with the ancient descriptions of a ship built to carry a single, immensely heavy stone object down its center line. None of this constituted absolute proof, and the archaeologists and maritime historians who examined the find were careful, as good scholars are, not to overstate what the evidence could support. What they had was a hull of extraordinary size, found in a context that matched, in general terms, what ancient writers had described. They did not have an inscription naming the ship, no carved plaque declaring this to be the vessel that once carried an obelisk from Heliopolis to Rome. Identification in archaeology of this kind is rarely so tidy. Instead, scholars built their case the way such cases are usually built, through careful accumulation of corroborating detail. The size of the timbers, the apparent date of the ship's construction based on associated materials and building techniques, the location of the find within a harbour whose history was independently known to connect to the story of the obelisk's arrival, and the broad consistency between the ship's evident scale and the ancient descriptions of a vessel built to carry stone weighing many hundreds of tons. Taken together, these threads pointed strongly, though not with absolute certainty, toward an identification. That this buried hull was very likely the same ship, or at least a ship of the same singular type and purpose that had once carried Caligula's obelisk across the sea. The work of piecing together the vessel's true scale, from what survived, was neither quick nor simple. Timbers that have spent nearly 2,000 years buried in wet harbour mud do not come out of the ground looking like a ship. They come out as fragments, waterlogged, distorted by centuries of pressure and chemical change, requiring careful excavation, recording, conservation, and reconstruction before they can be understood as parts of a coherent whole. Maritime archaeologists specializing in ancient hull construction spent long seasons measuring individual timbers, tracing the curve of frames, calculating from surviving sections what the original dimensions of the complete vessel must have been. It is exacting incremental work, closer in spirit to solving a vast puzzle with most of its pieces missing than to anything resembling a dramatic unveiling. And the conclusions it produces are always offered as estimates and probabilities, rather than certainties. That carefulness has meant that debate continues even now over exactly how large the ship truly was and how confidently the Fiumicino hull can be tied to the specific voyage described by Pliny and the other ancient writers. Some scholars, working from the surviving timbers and comparing them against the ancient textual descriptions of the Obelisk ship's cargo capacity, argue for dimensions that align closely with what the old accounts imply: enders. Others urge more caution, noting the incompleteness of the archaeological remains and the difficulty of ruling out that this was simply another very large vessel, built for some other exceptional cargo whose story did not happen to survive in any surviving text. The debate persists in the quiet, careful way that most genuine historical debates persist, in academic papers and conference discussions rather than dramatic revelations, each new study adding nuance rather than settling the matter definitively. It is, in its own way, a fitting continuation of a story that has always lived somewhat uncertainly between hard fact and half legend, between the obelisk that indisputably still stands in Rome and the ship that can only be inferred with careful confidence but not absolute proof from what the ground gave up. There is something quietly striking, almost symmetrical, in where the ship was ultimately found. It did not wash up somewhere along the coast, discarded and forgotten, far from the world it had served. It was found within the very harbour whose growth and function it had helped to enable, sunk deliberately into the foundations of the port that had once welcomed it home after its single extraordinary voyage. The ship that had carried the weight of an obelisk across open water had, in its final act, been made to carry the weight of a harbour wall instead, buried beneath the very stones of the port it had helped to build into being, resting there through the long centuries while the obelisk it once carried stood in open daylight in the heart of Rome. Tucked one, hidden entirely from view, the other visible to every passing eye, both of them, in their very different ways, still waiting to be understood.